Hey everyone, this is the first episode of our brand new Centurions Podcast with my friend Mark. I'm Yuri. Mark, what would you like to tell people about yourself?
Okay, I've been a Centurions fan since pretty much since the show went on the air. I didn't start buying the toys until they were discontinued, which means that I got some real bargains. Like I bought Detonator at Toys R Us for $2. Yes, really. And unfortunately, I had to get rid of a bunch of them due to financial reversals. Although I do still have my Rex Charger prototype. Yes, really. And I think that Centurions is a great idea for a toy line. It's built around the gimmick like a lot of 80s toy lines were, but it's a brilliant creative gimmick because it lets you be the toy designer because you can take the various assault weapon systems and combine them any way you want. By the way, if you don't know what an assault weapon system is or what the Centurions are, well, maybe we should have a little intro to get you up to speed.
Definitely, that's definitely a good idea. So, just a bit of intro about me, I guess. Mark is a few years older than me. I was actually born the year Centurions came out, so to me, it was I would say it's like a later experience when in Europe, where I'm from, Cartoon Network started to do reruns of 80s shows. There was this cartoon block called Power Zone, and there were other 80s themed or other cartoons from the 80s, including the Centurions. So for me, it was, as opposed to what Mark said, that he lived through that period and purchased the toys. I didn't even have access to the toys because I was a baby.
I was in the middle of a golden age. And I didn't even know it.
Yeah. The toys back then were like way better than I think what happened in the maybe the late '90s or since then. But yeah, so basically that's my story. I remember I was in high school when eBay was became available in Europe too, and I got my first Jake Rockwell figure with, of course, with Fire Force. Through eBay, through like from America. So that was pretty exciting, and nobody knew what it was, but everybody remembered. Yeah, kind of like they saw these reruns as well, but it wasn't a hit over there, unfortunately. So yeah, so that's about me, and like Mark said, we should definitely talk about the show a bit and the weapon systems, what weapons the assault weapon system is, and just because maybe someone remembers the show who's listening right now, but maybe you are not really familiar with the people. Maybe you remember the guy who looks like Tom Selleck with the mustache within the green outfit, or you remember the evil guy who has like a half robot body. So here we'll give you like a brief introduction on the characters and the weapon system. So Mark, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, here's the format of the show and the backstory of the toy line. It's the future. Overall, a pretty nice place, except you have this cyborg mad scientist named Doc Terror and his henchman, a thug named Hacker, who are trying to take over the world and turn everybody into their cyborg slaves. Doesn't sound like a fun time. So what do you do about it? Well, if you're the World Council of Scientists, you get some of the future's best warriors, and you assemble them into a team that uses high tech against the high tech villains. Okay, so they get these three guys who are the best in their field. Max Ray, the sea operations guy, Jake Rockwell, the land operations guy, and Ace McCloud, the air operations guy. And they give them these super suits called exoframes, which were originally meant to be spacesuits, and they've been modified to hold these weapons called assault weapon systems, which attach directly to the suits and basically turn each member of the team into a one-man army. And they have all these lasers and missile launchers and other cool weapons. And so they use these to go against Terror Hacker and their army of robotic doom drones, which include the strafers, the traumatizers, and various other threats. Their mission control is a woman named Crystal Kane who supervises their activities from the space station Sky Vault. And there are some other major characters you should know about, such as Amber, Doctor's daughter, a con artist who will sometimes help her dad and sometimes go against him. The Centurions have some pets, which are Shadow, the Malamute dog, and Lucy, the orangutan. And in later episodes and in the mostly unproduced second year of the toy line, they introduce some new characters, namely Rex Charger, the energy specialist, and John Thunder, the stealth specialist. And that's pretty much it. Doc Terror tries to take over the world. The Centurions try to stop him and blow up his various weapons and tech, and that's pretty much it.
Right, right. And before we go on to talk about the weapon systems themselves, I think it's interesting to mention that since it's one of those shows where there are members who are on who have probably the same rank, equal-ish ranks, people could pick their favorites, and there's always a discussion of like who's your favorite, who's the other guy's favorite, and it's interesting that if I remember correctly, Max Ray is supposedly the team's leader or de facto leader, or he's like he's supposed to be the elected leader. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, he's kind of the field commander. Yeah, although I'd have to watch the show again to make sure, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of him ordering the other two around because they're all experts in their fields and they know what to do to stop Terror and his forces.
Right, right. And I was also surprised to read this somewhere. For this specific show, it's interesting that there are few, major sources for information. There are two wikis online, one of which is is edited by Mark as well. And yeah, it's you have to kind of put together the information piece by piece.
Well, I don't actually run centurions.fandom.com. I have just edited and some articles and started others. And there's another one called powerextreme.fandom.com, which has some of the same information and some different information. And there's Wikipedia, there's TV tropes, there's several Facebook groups, including the one both Yuri and I belong to. So, yeah, if you're looking for information, you can find it, including some pretty rare stuff about pre-production and where the show and the toy line would have gone if they had continued.
Right, right. And as Mark mentioned, if you didn't hear about this podcast through being a member of the Facebook group, then just go to Facebook and look for Centurions Power Extreme, discussed by Cell Trade. That's the name of the group. There aren't that many Centurions themed groups, although it's funny that once a guy joined the group early on and he's like, oh, he thought this is about like Roman centurions, and then maybe we had to kind of refine the description of the group. So yeah, so it's one of those like little those little things where you have to kind of piece your information together from various sources, like Mark mentioned, and yeah, there are like back in the late 90s 2000s there were many of these geocities and these Yahoo pages, these free web hosts which are now defunct, and those have also some Centurions themed fan pages, which unfortunately are not accessible as live web pages anymore. But
I'm sorry, I was going to say that some of them might be available on archive.org.
yes, yes. So you can use the Wayback Machine to visit some of them. It's useful to remember, the name if you visited it before, because you might not be able to search for it, but if you know the URL, then you can track it back and look for some information there. So yeah, so we might delve into some of these later on, but yeah. So briefly, Mark, let's go on and go into, unless you wanted to mention anything else, the weapon systems.
No, we can start with the weapon systems. So, did you want to start or should I?
Oh, sorry. Maybe I went. Did we discuss the characters completely,
Yeah, that's
or I
probably
don't know where?
that is actually much more important. Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I'll I'll let you go into details, or free to interrupt me. Yeah. So basically, there were the three core characters: Jake, the rugged land operations specialist; Ace was the aerial expert; and Max. And one of the funny things why I think the anti-Jake fans, who I would say are mostly Ace fans, put the blame on Jake as like everyone's favorite Centurion, quote unquote, because he got both a helicopter, like an aerial, assault weapon system, and also I would say Wild Weasel is kind of like a, it since it's like based on speed, and I would also say that it's kind of like an exotic, weapon systems that the others didn't have an equal for, I would say.
It's
But Mark,
basically,
what do you think about that? Like,
well, yeah, I gotta say, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, but Wild Weasel is one of my favorites of the assault weapon systems. It's basically a motorcycle. Yeah, well, we remember everybody. This is the first episode, and we have done absolutely no preparation for it.
right, right,
With, with any luck, by episode 5, we'll all be, you know, sensing when each other is ready to talk like a well-oiled machine. But as for now, you'll just have to bear with us. Okay, so yeah, so Max Ray, as we noted, he is sort of the team leader, the intellectual of the group. Yeah, he is the smart one and the most sensible, and the one who's most prone to making battle plans to stop terrorist forces the most efficiently. Yeah, I gotta say, of these characters, it's a little disappointing because the show didn't go very deep into any of them, which it really could have, because there were only a handful of main characters in contrast with a show like G.I. Joe or He-Man, where you have a dozen characters running around in every given episode. But, well, we'll do the best we can. So Max is more or less the leader. Yeah, Jake is the land guy. He is. Oh yeah, and also something I should note about Max before we go on. Yes, he does look like Tom Selleck. Yes, that is deliberate. Just as, and here's a segue for you. Jake was based on Harrison Ford, although I don't know how much of that shows in the final design. Yeah, Jake is.
really? I didn't know that.
Oh,
That's surprising. Like, that's in the show Bible.
well, that's what I read somewhere. Yeah, it might be in the show Bible, which I have a copy of, and I hope to share with everybody someday. But yeah, Jake is a 21st century cowboy. He has the most Leroy Jenkins tendencies on the team, which is he doesn't like to use stealth or guile. He just wants to rush in, guns all blazing against the Doom drones and whatever terror is throwing against them. And Amber, Doc Terry's daughter, is kind of attracted to him. Him, not so much. And then we come with the third main Centurion, Ace McCloud, the air guy. Yeah, he is a very colorful character. Yeah, he's a fiery redhead. He is sort of an Errol Flynn, the which is what the writer's guide compares him to. Yeah, he's dashing and daring, and courageous and caring. Sorry, I slipped into the Gummy Bears theme for a moment. But yeah, he really likes to blow up Terror's Doom drones. He's also a little arrogant and conceited, and might be a little controversial for saying this, but some of the aspects of his character don't look as good in the Me Too age because, I mean, he can't pass any kind of attractive single woman without going, "Hey, pretty lady," and trying to get them to go on a date.
So, Mark, you mentioned that very valid point that in today's, just different cultural landscape, Ace's behavior might be, seen as controversial. And if you remember, I have specifically this scene in my mind, maybe because it was like clipped and it's on YouTube, where like Rex and Ace walk after like this team meeting, and they try to like figure each other out, and they both turn around after this beautiful woman, and then they look at each other and laugh, and that it's established that there's this bonding between like the two because they both like beautiful women. So it's kind of interesting. That's like a tidbit about like a character we'll talk about later, Rex Charger, who was introduced later. But it's interesting that these small gestures basically are the ones that tell us about the characters, because like Mark said, we don't really know much about their backstory, like their families, or there are some episodes which are built on their backgrounds, but we'll talk about that later as well. Like we know that Crystal had a boyfriend who went missing, and there's an episode about that. But it's really interesting that the people like just saw the action, but not they didn't really see much of the character's background. So, what's your take on that, Mark?
Well, I wish they had done more characterization on the show. I think that would have been a good thing and would have set apart from some of the other action adventure series that were on then. But they made their choices, and maybe in a way it's a good thing, because if you're a fan and you want to do a fanfic or something, then that means that their backgrounds are open wide for you to play with, as long as you don't contradict anything that was on the show.
Yeah, I agree. And also for a potential reboot, or maybe even like I guess from a writer's perspective, it would have been a really great opportunity in later seasons, which were never produced, unfortunately, to delve into the backgrounds of the characters and maybe build storylines on that. And that window was left open by not doing this much characterization as maybe other series. So yeah, I would say that Max is the most I would say in lifestyle conservative of the characters, as in like he doesn't really have any weird quirks about him. He's not a womanizer. He's the smart guy of the team. Jake is like this kind of southern U.S., like I don't know, Texan or Alabama kind of cowboy, and Ace is the Errol Flynn type womanizer. But there were two new characters added.
Okay,
And
well,
Mark,
first,
would you talk about those as well?
in the writer's guide, which was adapted for some character bios in the American comic book, it specifies that Jake is from Austin, Texas, and I guess he grew up on a
Oh,
ranch.
wow.
Yeah, it has. It has a lot of stuff in there that's not in the TV series. The actual stories have some backstory that is contradicted by the TV series, but once again, we're getting way ahead of ourselves.
Right, right. Well, one thing that I wanted to add is that Jake Rockwell's voice actor, and we would definitely talk about the talent behind the show later on. But Vince Edwards was actually from Brooklyn, so it was a Brooklynite playing a Texan that I really find funny. So yeah, that's just a small detail. But please go ahead,
Yeah.
talk about the rest of the cast.
Yeah, whereas Ace was the one who was canonically from New York City. Anyway,
Oh, really?
yeah.
Interesting. And Ace's voice actor Neil Ross was from London, England, so it's it's a conundrum.
Okay, and Max is from Seattle. I have no idea where Pat Fraley is from. Maybe you would
Pat
know.
Fraley is from Seattle. He's from Seattle.
Oh, really?
Yes, I just checked his IMDb page.
Yeah, and according to the writer's guide, Crystal Kane, or we're coming up on her, is from San Francisco. Do you know where Diane Pershing is from?
Let me guess. Oh wait, she's from Queens, isn't she?
I don't know. I'd have to look it up. Anyway, but
She's from
Chris.
yeah. I just checked. She's from Queens, right here.
Okay, cool. But enough of that little tangent. You want to hear about
Mm.
the remaining Centurions characters? You're gonna hear about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, Crystal Kane is more or less a Centurion's boss. She supervises their activities from Skyvault, the space station where she lives, and a bunch of the other Centurions support personnel, and where the assault weapon systems are stored. And she'll keep track of what they're doing while they're in battle, and she will suggest which assault weapon systems and battle tactics are best suited to a given situation. And Ace flirts with a lot of women. Crystal is the one he's really interested in, and sometimes she'll get annoyed with him. And the way Ace carries on, you can't really blame her, but sometimes she'll return his interest. It depends on the episode and what's going on at that particular moment. And since we're doing the heroes, we might as well mention the two pets. Shadow the Malamute. Jake takes care of him, although he, like Lucy, is a pet to the whole team. He has a mini assault weapon system that he can wear sort of a metal harness, and Lucy is Crystal's pet orangutan. They are in the series, I've been told, because Joe Ruby of Ruby Spears, the studio that did the show, he liked to have dogs in all his series, and also with Lucy, the idea for that came from, of course, Every Which Way But Loose. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, and there were some minor characters like Dr. Wu and Mei Ling, but I don't really remember much about them except that they worked at Skyvault and helped the Centurions out in specific occasions. But anyway, so here we go on to, well, do you want to do the villains or should I?
I can tag in, right? Thanks. So yeah, with the villains, the story has an interesting structure. So, or the series, as in the main villains were Doc Terror and Hacker. Doc Terror was a scientist who basically developed this technology to fuse man and machine, and he recruited Hacker as his main henchman, who was, submitted to this process, and he gained a robotic half, as in the cartoons, and Doctor was injured, if I remember correctly, and then he told Hacker to put him in the machine, and he was also converted. And the two robotic halves were called Legion and Syntax. And there was one episode where they combined and became a super unstoppable AI.
Yeah, the two-part episode, The Better Half. And by the way, that is Legion with an S, not with a G. But yeah, let me add to that by telling you how Doc Terror got injured. Terror made Hacker the first cyborg. He took him in to show off to the Council of World Scientists, and they said, excuse me. And so they said, well, this is really unethical what you're doing. Get out of here. And So then they go back, and Hacker says, "Hey Doc, when do you turn me back human again?" And Tara says, "What do you mean, you fool? You can't go back." And Hacker is so unhappy to hear this that he has a violent tantrum, and he is the one who injures Terror, and Terror saves himself by subjecting himself to his own cyborgization process. And with that done, he decides, wow, this is really great. I'm going to share it with the rest of the human race, whether they want it or not. So he builds this army of doom drones, primarily including two robots called Strafer and Traumatizer, who were in the toy line, and some lesser ones such as Seaborg and Groundborg, which were not in the toy line. And they go to work, attacking the world and stealing stuff and wreaking havoc, and the Centurions have to stop them. And the other,
Right.
and the other major villain was Amber, Doc Terror's daughter, who is this con artist who has a contentious relationship with her father. He wants to remake the entire world. She just wants to get rich. Yeah, and there's at least one episode where she goes to the Centurions and tells them, "Hey, Dad's gone crazy. He wants to destroy the world. You gotta stop him." But in the end, if Terror's about to be captured, she will always make sure he escapes.
Right, and Amber has an uncanny ability to disguise herself as even Crystal Kane, or the local scientist or whatever, and that's her. Basically, she doesn't need an exoframe because she's kind of like a master of disguise type character, like Zartan from GI Joe.
Yeah, anytime you see a new female character on the series, about half the time it's Amber in disguise, infiltrating the Centurions to find out what they're up to, and this happens again and again.
Right, and I think it's a really interesting aspect to mention that one thing is that we go into so many topics that we'll delve into in later episodes, hopefully. But it's just interesting to touch on some of these things, like for example, how I think this show is pretty progressive when it comes to women's roles, as when you compare the Baroness from GI Joe, who's a similar kind of infiltration specialist or special ops, character. Amber is really, spearheading some of Doctor's, missions as this infiltrator. So she's not like a damsel in distress, or like a good-looking bimbo, but she's actually very active, spearheading her father's missions.
Yeah, Crystal and Amber are both pretty awesome characters, which is good considering that they are the two main female characters on the show, and otherwise this is like a really macho and manly show.
Right. So it's interesting that they were able to put into a 80s macho manly show two female characters, one as a protagonist, another as an antagonist, who's not just there to fill a quota, so to say. One interesting aspect I also want to mention regarding the characters, we'll talk about the origins of the show later. There are documents detailing both in the show Bible that Mark has and available online that detail the origins of the show. And for example, the the story series original draft name was Tech Team. And in that, for example, Doctor has a different origin story. He even is credited for creating the Centurions, this assault weapon system, and how it connects to humans' bodies. And I think, if I remember correctly, there the story was that he suffered an accident.
He had a plane crash.
He had a plane crash. Thank you. And basically, he had, this is the way he saved himself by rebuilding part of his body as a robot. But that the robot AI that was in that robotic half corrupted his mind. So basically, there he wasn't necessarily, if I remember correctly, a negative character, but more like he was corrupted by a malicious AI.
Kind of like Lord Dredd from Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future.
Oh, I haven't seen that, but if you say so, quite probably. So so many topics pop up, and I really don't want to steer away from what we planned for this episode, but it's
Oh, of
interesting that
course not. Yeah, I'm just
because I know we could go into like tangents, but it's interesting how like it will come back over and over again. Hopefully, that this show is really really was visionary in its themes, and for example, integrating man and machine, like what we see nowadays with Elon Musk, and what happens in science, and also the potentially corrupting nature of this fusion of man and machine have been a centerpiece of the stories, of the show. So um, that's just something interesting that popped into
yeah.
my mind.
And also, what I found interesting is that there are ways to do it positively, as the Centurions do, and negatively, as Doc Terror does. Okay, yeah. We don't want to forget the two new members of the Centurions who were introduced near the end of the series and who would have been figures in the toy line's mostly canceled second year. Rex Charger was an energy specialist. He had a glow-in-the-dark exoframe, which is actually a lot more obvious on the prototype, if you're lucky enough to have one, than in the TV show itself. He was both a brilliant scientist and a millionaire playboy before joining the Centurions, which makes him sort of a cross between Ace and Max. And his weapon systems were highly advanced even by the Centurions' standards. And John Thunder,
Right.
John Thunder was a Native American, specifically a Chiricahua Apache, and a direct descendant of Geronimo. And okay, there's no way to get around this. Some aspects of the character are stereotypical. He was always bare-chested, even when he was wearing his exoframe, and one of his weapon systems, Silent Arrow, was basically like a giant high-tech bow and arrow. But on the other hand, he was one of the best characters in the show. He was very intelligent and dignified, and he had a bond with animals and nature, and he could sneak into and out of any enemy territory. In the climactic episode, he even infiltrates Dominion, Doc Terror's Arctic fortress, which the Centurions had never been able to do earlier in the show. So you got to give him props for that.
Right, and it's interesting that he's not a super offensive stereotype. So I've seen there are available some draft concepts of him, and some like in some drawings he has a mohawk, and so he's compared to the times he's treated pretty well. Although yeah, that I don't know how not wearing a shirt connects to being an infiltration specialist. Maybe shirts in the near future are very rattly and they make a lot of noise, and that's why he's not wearing a shirt. But it's that was one interesting part.
Well, I think it was meant to be more of a Native American thing, which, well, I don't think that they would do that today if they brought the character and the show back, which I hope happens eventually. But yeah, John Thunder was still a pretty awesome character.
Right, and I think maybe one of the aspects that made him special is that of course it was a different time, but all the main cast, everyone was white, and he was just a minority character in the show, even though supporting cast included people of other ethnicities. And yeah, and I always found it interesting. I'm curious about your view on this. That we had a specialist in the form of Rex Charger, who was an energy specialist who used a different uh, type of weaponry, and we had John, who was an infiltration specialist who used a different method of basically fighting. And yet all even John's armaments were pretty like a huge bow or crossbow, or they were pretty over the top. So what was your perception of that?
Well, yeah, and then there was his other weapon system, Thunder Knife, which was basically a gigantic circular saw, and when he's wearing it. He spins around like he's on the tilt-a-whirl, which is not very scientifically accurate. I don't know what it would do to somebody if you were actually wearing this thing and spinning around, but I always thought it was cool, and I would love to get my hands on that prototype if it's out there. But yeah, I mean, like I said, even though Centurions had a science lesson at the end of every episode, I mean, parts of it were pretty silly and cheesy and over the top, as with pretty much most of the '80s cartoons, and you either roll with it or you watch something else.
Right. And a few things regarding that. Um, One of the interesting aspects of the show was that animation was heavily influenced by Japanese, anime, and their animation was partially focusing on these huge mechas, these huge robots that were piloted by humans. Transformers was really popular around that time,
And of
although
course,
it kind of debuted at the same time.
there is the ever popular Gundam franchise.
Yeah, it's true. So basically, even if you watch the intro sequence, specifically the two frames that pop into my mind were, or three frames actually, were when Jake is shown and he basically, his chest cannon kind of cuts through the Doom drones when Max launches his missiles at the minion, and then when kind of the final scene where in the intro where um, Ace does this trick in the air and shoots rockets or missiles at the other drones following him. Those really show a Japanese influence that I think a lot of American cartoons didn't really tap into, and that's what this kind of multicultural, this multi genre thing put in subtly in the show was probably something that really spiced up the show's visuals, because it wasn't the typical US show where like people used guns, but it was like aerial maneuvers and all these interesting action oriented angles that really made combat scenes in the shows really pop even back then.
Indeed, yes. And while Ruby Spears was the animation studio, a lot of the work was subcontracted to Sunrise, which is an anime studio who had worked on the Gundam franchise and also worked on a lot of other famous anime series. And I think they had a subsidiary called, if I remember correctly, Studio 7, which did a lot of the actual animation work. So, yeah, no wonder it looks so anime influenced. It was actually animated in Japan, just as most of the '80s cartoons were animated overseas because labor was cheaper.
hmm Yeah, and it's interesting how back then I think Japanese animation, although you're older, so you can testify if it was so or not. Japanese animation didn't really show up in the US yet. I think the '90s was the time when franchisers were really showing up on American channels, being imported and dubbed. So this was kind of like a herald of an age where American audiences were open to Japanese animation and Japanese style animation and show structures.
Well, let me put it this way, and this is going to be a tangent, so you can cut it out if you want. There have been Japanese cartoons running in America at least since the '60s with Kimba, Speed Racer, Astro Boy, shows like that. However, in the '80s, there were people who were into Japanimation, as it was called then, but it didn't have the cultural penetration that it does now. I mean, there wasn't anything like Toonami, where you have an entire programming block based on the fact that, okay, here are all these Japanese animation cartoons. So yeah, Centurions was a little ahead of its time there.
Right, and you're right about animes really having their own subculture nowadays in the US, and that Centurions was not in cartoon markets where a big chunk was being taken away by Japanese animation, as what happened in the 90s. And nowadays, when you go to any of these conventions, Comic Con, etc., you see that a large number of people are really into Japanese animation, and I'm just curious how the Centurions would have done in the 90s, for example, or maybe if they debuted in the 2000s, like how differently it would have been received.
Well, that's an interesting what if game to play. I think part of the reason that it failed in 1986, even though a lot of people have fond memories of it from that era, is that there was just so much competition out there. I mean, after He-Man hit it big, there was a gold rush of all these toy companies and animation studios rushing to make toy-based cartoons. And, Centurions got caught in the middle of that. It didn't always get the best time slots. A lot of the local stations ran it at, say, 6:30 a.m. Some major markets took it off the air after a few months because it didn't get the ratings they wanted. And I think that if the show had come along at a different time when there was less competition, it might have done better, and so might the toy line.
Yeah, yeah, it probably
anyway,
was a question of the wrong circumstances.
Yeah, but anyway, getting back to the point of your question, yeah, if the show had come along when anime was better known to the mainstream public, especially after like the breakthrough of something like Pokemon, then well, maybe that will make a difference, maybe not. Who knows?
Mm. Mark, we haven't really created a structure for the show actually, so there aren't really any set, recurring elements or anything. But I think one would be interesting to start. Or one element to have is to have one question, and now we're nearing the last maybe 10-15 minutes of the show. I was thinking of we could have one question that's like an open-ended question to you, question to maybe me as well, and to whoever's listening. And wherever this is posted, I'm curious if people could share their opinions on these questions. And I was thinking that the first question for today, if you agree, and I'm curious about your take on it, was that if Centurions would have been an anime, or if it would have been completely created in Japan and would have had that background where these robot themed, these mecha themed shows were already super popular. And this is a question to you, Mark, and a question to our listeners. Do you think it would have done completely differently?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, I can imagine say that. Well, and also a lot of it depends on if it had been made for a Japanese audience or for an international audience. Typically a lot of anime shows will be set in Tokyo or some other part of Japan and have Japanese casts. Now, in the past, the American dubs tried to cover that up as much as they could, but now they're not bothering. But on the other hand, you get the occasional show with a cast of characters from around the world, and I actually think that would have worked for Centurions the same way it worked for a show like Mask.
You mean to have like a multicultural main cast?
Yes, and the writer's guide mentioned that the team basically works with Future Interpol, and that there could be members from other countries coming up in the future. Sadly, the show and the toy line were canceled before that had a chance to happen.
Right. And being mindful of our time, we still have roughly, I think, about 10 minutes. And I think we should still continue discussing the show and maybe the characters and the setting. But let's, move the, discussion of the extra frames to the next episode.
That sounds good.
Because we were like wondering beforehand whether we would have enough things to say about the show, and I think we still have like hours and hours worth of stuff to tell you guys and discuss with you guys. One thing that we will have in the future, hopefully, um, uh, would be or will be interviews, because a lot of the writers and the voice talent are still alive. So, for example, if you check the IMDb page of the show, you can check that and see that I think Pat Fraley, Max Ray's voice actor, Neil Ross, Ace McLeod's voice actor, they're both alive. Unfortunately, Vince Edwards left us, so Jake Rockwell's voice is not available anymore. But there are so many people who are still around.
I can give you the stats on a couple of the others. Michael Bell, John Thunder, he's alive. Robert Ridgely, Rex Charger, he's dead. Doc Terror, Ron Feiberg, and Hacker, Ed Gilbert, unfortunately, they're both dead. But,
Mhm.
we are hoping that if this podcast takes off, that we can talk to some of the surviving voice cast and other people who worked on the show. By the way, as long as we're mentioning this, I would like to dedicate this first episode to Ted Peterson, the late Ted Peterson, who was the story editor of the cartoon, and he was the source of a lot of my information about the show. And he was a very nice man who was always willing to talk to me about one of his favorite projects that he ever worked on. So here's to you, Ted.
Absolutely, that's a very nice gesture, and of course, without him and his information that was provided to Mark, a lot of this would have been lost. And that's one of our kind of secret goal with this podcast, is to raise this sounds so formal, but to raise awareness of the show and to find you know to find more people who like it, and maybe people who have contributed to it, and just bring it back in memory. And hopefully, maybe if the interest comes back, then maybe reach out maybe to Hasbro, or although this is maybe a pipe dream, reach out to Hasbro and say like, hey, you brought Rom back, Masters of the Universe, all these other series,
Well,
GI
that
Joe
was
is making
Mattel,
also
but
a comeback.
well, that was Mattel. But yeah, I get the point you're making, which is that all these other '80s franchises are coming back. Why not Centurions? And well, let's say that as far as we, the fans, are able to tell, the situation is complicated, but that's probably a topic for another time.
Definitely, and then again, that's basically what we were talking about, is that uh, information is so scarce about the show beyond what you received, and through the show Bible, and what anecdotal information we have of the show, or information through the episodes, that basically we just don't know certain things. And maybe asking some people who were involved with the show, we can uncover information that maybe might make it easier to actually revive the show potentially, or figure out at least who's the rights holder. Is it the is it Kenner's current rights holder, Hasbro? Is it the Ruby Spears heirs, or who has controlling ownership of the copyright?
Yeah, the Ruby Spears catalog is owned by Warner Brothers, so they might be involved.
I actually wonder if, like, how this worked back. This of course is a discussion for maybe another episode, but how this actually worked out, where basically the toy company Kenner had ownership of the toy line, but then the animation company had ownership completely of the the cartoon, and then another third company had the ownership of the comic books.
Well, I don't think. Well, I think that Ruby Spears owned the comic books as they owned all the non-toy merchandising for Centurions. I can tell you this really quickly, and this is something I learned from Ted Peterson. So
Mhm.
when the Kenner people went to Ruby Spears and said, "Hey, we have this new toy line called Centurions. We want you to make a cartoon out of it," they said, "Well, we're working on this similar project called Super Suits." And I don't know if that was a placeholder name. I know nothing else about the project except from what Ted told me. So I guess they decided that since Ruby Spears already had the similar idea that they would divide the rights, and Kenner would have the rights to the toys, and Ruby Spears would have the rights to the non-toy merchandise, which is why if you see like a Centurions coloring book or lunchbox or whatever, it'll say Ruby Spears Enterprises instead of Kenner Parker Toys.
Oh, that's super interesting. I didn't know that. That's interesting. These these collaborations are always so fascinating because, for example, and again, this is just really as a footnote, a short tangent. With Transformers, what happened was that those toys were available, or were designed mostly for the Diaclone line in Japan, and then Hasbro just thought, oh, this is really cool. Let's bring it over and create a storyline for it. So basically, they took the toys but reinvented the kind of the storyline behind it. And here, there's also like this collaboration between toy manufacturer and cartoon, or TV studio.
Yes, indeed, and stuff like that was done pretty often in the '80s. Like this is another tangent that I don't know if you'll want to keep or not, but Tonka had a deal with Bandai in Japan, which is how they got the rights to the toy lines that became GoBots, Rock Lords, and Spiral Zone.
Oh wow, yeah, I remember GoBots actually as a rival to Transformers, and I also remember that it was earlier, or it was actually GoBots were released earlier than Transformers, but neither of them took, I think, IP from the other or took any ideas. One question I have to you is, do you know of any cartoons slash toy lines with a similar predicament as Centurions, where which had such a mixed status, but were also brought back recently? Do you know of any examples?
Well, let's see. The rights to Thundercats, I think, were partially owned by the toy line and partially owned by LJN, the toy company, and partially owned by Ted Wolf, who created the characters. And but yeah, the point is that you can cut through any of that right stuff if somebody thinks that there is enough money involved. So maybe the thing is, nobody thinks Centurions is a valuable enough property to do the necessary work to ascertain the rights. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would love to see Centurions come back. It's certainly, it has a cult following. It's better remembered than some of the toys from the '80s. So yeah, I think that under the right circumstances, it could still be a hit because it has a great concept.
Definitely, and it's interesting that, at least I don't know how, like, what your interactions were like with fellow fans, or people who watched cartoons and were the same age as you, but I remember even when I went to college, and even as a kid, and even as an adult, bumping into people my age, who, like, when you ask them what was your favorite cartoon as a kid, they were like, oh, Tom and Jerry, or I don't know, Johnny Bravo, or some of these like newer shows. And I'm like, do you remember a show called Centurions? And it was about these guys who had like these suits, and they could summon weapons from a space station. And they're like, oh yeah, that was a really cool show, now that you mention it. So it's one of those shows where, like, people wouldn't necessarily mention it as their favorite show, or wouldn't even remember it, but necessarily, unless told about the show, and then you would remind them, and they're like, oh, that's such a cool show. So it's one of those, like, I don't know, I think for many people it's like their second, third, fourth favorite show, but they wouldn't necessarily like be a collector or aware, because the show didn't have those many episodes or toys to make it stay in people's minds.
Yeah, and that's the thing. But yeah, I mean, Centurions is probably better known for its Cartoon Network reruns than was ever known for its original run in syndication.
Right, quite probably. I am actually curious what the age breakdown in our group on Facebook would be, because I know that there are some people who are my age, and some people who are your age, who are all other collectors. Shout out to people in that group, like Nick, one of the admins,
And Anthony.
and Anthony, of course, and there are so many people we could mention, but we're kind of getting to the end of the show. So
It's a big group. There's nearly 800 members as we're recording this.
wow, 800. So maybe it's just a freak accident that the show wasn't rediscovered yet, and maybe we can, with our with our small contribution to the fandom, maybe help bring back the show. But this is nothing that's planned or anything. We're just like hoping as fans to bring it back. So yeah, in the future we're planning to, if things go well and people are interested in hearing us just talk, the way we do, about the show, we could bring on guests. Mark knows some people, and we could discuss episodes, because episodes might be online available for everyone to watch, and then we can discuss episodes, themes. So yeah, stay tuned. And Mark, do you have anything else to add now that we're coming to an end of this first episode?
Well, I would like to add that the entire series is available on DVD from Warner Archive. And I think that might be the only official Centurions merchandise that's available now. If you want to support the show and prove to whoever owns the rights that there is still an audience for it, that would be a good way to support Centurions.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mark. There might be ways to, of course, illegally stream the episodes made available by fans, maybe on YouTube and some other websites. But if you really wanted to show the rights holders, Warner, that you want this show to come back in some shape or form, then the only, or probably the best way, would be to buy these DVDs. And if I remember correctly, these are the types of DVDs where, like, it's not necessarily available as typical DVDs, but they are, if you order these, they are custom burned, because there's such a low volume, or of orders usually for these discs. So if you could, show that, oh, the show is being, sold again, or these episode DVDs are sold again and again, you know, who knows what might happen, but it needs the fans.
Yeah, it's called Manufacture on Demand, and Warner only presses up copies of Centurions or any of their archive catalog when somebody actually orders them. So, yeah, that'll be a great way to show the powers that be that maybe you should give this show a second chance.
Right, because they don't really see if you buy a figure, a loose Jake or Ace or Max, on eBay. They don't track that, but this might be the only way to show our support. And if you ever go to a comic book convention, or any of these fan conventions, I know that Hasbro always has a panel at the New York Comic Con, which I was lucky enough to visit last year. I don't know if it happens this year. They all, like, Hasbro always has a panel and a booth, because they reveal Transformers figures there. Also true for San Diego Comic Con, SDCC. So if you're there, you could even just walk over to the Hasbro booth and say, like, hey, we're fans of the Centurions. Is there any way we could, bring the show back, or you know, can you let people know? Because there are like lead toy designers there, and people who actually can do something about it, and they are in their 40s, 50s, and if you mention it to them, they might be like, oh yeah, I remember that show. That gives me an idea. So you never know what chain of events you might start, reaching out to these people, if you happen to, for example, go to a convention.
Yeah, and the fate of one toy line or cartoon from the 80s doesn't really amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. But yeah, we all need a little fun in our lives. So, if you can do something to bring back one of your favorite entertainment franchises, why not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quality content, that we enjoyed, and there's no reason not for it not to have a place in the lives of kids and adults today. not just necessarily collectors of toys, but maybe kids today would appreciate it, but it's just not available to them. So it's up to us fans maybe to nowadays with the Kickstarters, with Indiegogos, with on demand toy manufacturing, what Hasbro recently started doing with their Unicron, not on demand, but it's like a Kickstarter kind of thing. There might be new avenues for us fans to demand something and basically have our voices heard.
Yeah, these crazy kids with their GoFundMe's. Yeah, so yeah, maybe we can get something going. Who knows? I mean, that would be one of the goals of this podcast. We're going to make it, we're going to party like it's 1987. Only this time you'll be able to buy Rex Charger and John Thunder in in Toys R Us or Kmart, which will both still be around because it's 1987.
Right. If like we were having this discussion in the Facebook group that yeah, it would be great to go back in time and change history, but you know what, we'd probably just go back to maybe 86, 87, and just buy the toys for like $2 like nowadays, even a loose. And we'll talk about weapon systems in the next episode, but one of those rare but produced weapon systems like uh, you know
Seabat
um,
and Swing Shot.
thank you. Like, yeah, like I was just looking at both on my shelf, and I'm like, okay, this cost like a fortune to get, and like back then they were like even maybe shelf warmers. So yeah, why save the history of humanity if you could just go back and uh, buy your beloved toys for like a few bucks, like Mark also did.
Yeah, or maybe create world peace or something. But why bother with that when you can just buy toys? But yeah,
Yeah,
but
world peace is so fleeting.
yeah, but anyway, yeah, but I mean, if you're really gonna do the time travel thing, you don't travel back to when the toys are on clearance. Yeah, if you're really gonna go back in time and buy these old Centurions toys, you don't buy them when they're on clearance. You buy them when they're full price because that's how Kenner will decide to make more of them in the past.
Yeah, that's very smart. So please, if any of you out there have or plan to invent a time machine, and you also plan on going back to the 80s, and also plan on buying, Centurions toys, please do it at full price, not clearance price, because that's how Hasbro or Kenner back then will know that this is something that's worth continuing.
Yeah, I mean, they'll have a sales report and something like, hey, Woolworth, there's another store that's long gone. Woolworth says that all their Centurions toys are selling. This is great.
Yeah, exactly. So if you need our credit cards, or rather cash, we'll just give it to you. Go back with your DeLorean or whatever, and just make sure to buy all the stocks.
Make sure that all your cash is dated before 1986 because that's what tripped up Christopher Reeve in Somewhere in Time.
Oh, that's smart. Now you know what, this could be another episode. Should you do if you want to buy Centurion's toys cheap and you happen to be able to go back to 86 or 87?
Yeah, and just buy plenty of them at Children's Palace and Kitty City so that those stores will stay around too. Go to all the stores that are closed now. Venture, Gold Circle, buy Centurions there.
Yeah, and even like Toys R Us just recently closed. So nobody is closure proof, or nobody's bankruptcy proof. So
Well, everybody's having problems these days. So yeah, that's a good way to support your chosen toy company or favorite toy line.
yeah, that's true. So with that, I think the time has come for us to beam back to Sky Vault, or if you feel like, go to Centrum, the other headquarters in New York City for the Centurions.
Oh, and don't forget Centurion Academy.
Centurion Academy. Oh yeah, where they were trained.
Yeah, it was featured in Man or Machine, which we will get to one of these days if this podcast continues long enough. And listeners, you'll be sure to leave feedback, tell us what you liked and didn't like. And I remind you, this is our first episode. It's a learning experience for everyone. You know, um, I'm certain that future episodes will be better than this one.
Well, I also think that technically there's a lot of space to improve and for us to gain some experience as well. But we really hope that you
Tell me
liked
about
this
it.
episode, and then
Mhm.
we were able and that we were able to, both Mark and I were able to tell you something new that you didn't know about the show yet. We'd love to continue telling stories and having you listen and interact. This is not just like your grandpa's radio. Feel free to leave a comment wherever you listen to the show. If you're a part of the Facebook community for Centurions, hit us up over there. If you listen to this on YouTube, then please like, share, and subscribe. I think that's what they usually say. And if you're on Stitcher or iTunes, please also subscribe and give a good rating to the show, because we're just trying to do this not for ourselves but for the fandom, for people like you.
Yeah, but wherever and however you're listening, we're grateful you found us.
Yeah, thank you for listening and for taking or offering us an hour of your life. We know that there is so much out there to listen to or to watch, to stream. So we hope that it was you think it was a smart investment of your time and you enjoyed yourself. And with that, Mark, any closing thought?
Just one. Power Extreme!